So what is the optimal tenant? And I suppose the answer to that is it's the one that's optimal for you as a landlord. Now, obviously, different people will have their preferences, but generally speaking, for me, it's people who've got reasonable income, who look after the property, who pay their rent on time, who stay around so that there aren't excessive void periods, and are in abundance, i.e., there are lots of these kind of people and they're desperate to rent somewhere. And there are a couple of interesting ways you can look at this. So, well, I think it's interesting. And here we are here, and we've got Datashine once again. And we can see that this area here, for example, doesn't have so much. Sorry, it doesn't have so much rented accommodation. So wherever it's very green, there's a high proportion of rented accommodation. And you can see in these kind of areas, 65%, etc. Now, one of the issues is that if you have too many rented properties in an area, it makes the property more difficult to sell. And therefore, it makes it a higher risk for a lender if you want to get a mortgage. And for me, at least, and for our clients, what I always suggest is that they look in areas where there just isn't quite so much rented property. And so Swinton is an example of this. And we can see here, as I said earlier, quite a lot of C1 live around here. We can also see that there's loads of C1 here, but the problem with this area is that it's very heavy on rented accommodation, which in my view is potentially an issue. Now, if you're interested in different social strata, you can play around with the data and find different variables. But what we do in our system is we aggregate all this information, and we have these little like logos, and the metric that we use is percentage who are not DE. So if somebody is social grade DE, they're typically unemployed or have very precarious incomes. And if you have a very high proportion of that type of person in an area, that's not so good. So for example, we can see here in this crime black spot that I talked about before, that there's actually a very high proportion of DEs, so 57%. And there's also a lot of social rented housing in this area. And generally, investors prefer to avoid socially rented areas with a lot of social housing, mainly because tenants prefer not to live in these areas, so they tend to avoid them. But anyway, the main point is that once you understand who you want to rent to, then you can start finding areas that have these kind of people in them. And from there, we'll move on to the next lecture.